I believe a modern state that integrates diversity while recognizing equity and equality should take three main concepts into account. The first is a legal framework, which basically consists of existing laws, creation of laws if needed, that protect and recognize the different indigenous groups that there are in our country. The second concept is representation. Um, I believe indigenous people should be better represented in the decision making processes that take place in our country. And the third one is education. With education, we can spread the awareness of the importance and the culture itself of those indigenous groups that often are not included, are somehow avoided, and I believe that education is an important point, of course. About the areas of opportunity um, related to the agreements made between the Mexican states and indigenous people, um, I believe that, of course, dialogue is a powerful tool that can uh, make the situation better for both parties, for the indigenous people, and also for those in power to understand those maybe marginalized groups. Um, so one area of opportunity is precisely the representation that indigenous groups have in our country. I believe they are not very present in the decision making. They are not very taken into account when something needs to be decided. I believe more people that are from those indigenous groups should be more present in the higher power of our country. And one important thing as well is an agreement or a commitment more from those in power in our country about the information they give to those indigenous groups. I truly believe that those in power often take advantage of of the indigenous people um, by misinforming them. They do not give them information, valuable information. They do not give them tools. They do not give them that education or that following they should have in order for them to make a good decision, an informed decision. For example, one example could be when voting, they usually take advantage of the indigenous people by gifting maybe goods for living, food, and it's just okay, take this, but in exchange, I want you to vote for me. And I don't think that's right. I think that is not a good competition. And I believe a good competition could be giving them information for them to know about other candidates, to know their proposals, so then they can make an informed decision, not just what they have been told to do in exchange for food or goods. And that's it. Given the fact that indigenous people are continually demanding for autonomy, I believe it is important to find these balance points, not balance points, but to guarantee both the protection of the individual rights and the protection of the customs and practices of their own uh, ethnical group as well. I believe this can be achieved. Of course, it is a complicated topic, but this can be, of course, achieved. There must be, of course, protective measures to the form of governance of each indigenous group. Yes, and as well protection to the individual rights. And this can come through dialogue, through negotiation between both parties, and that comes as well, in my opinion, from being better represented in the decision-making processes that take place in the higher power of our country. If they could have maybe a group of people that are from those indigenous groups, and those people positioned and visible to everyone, and of course that take into consideration the real needs and willing from the indigenous groups. I believe dialogue could take place, and good measures could follow.
Good afternoon, everyone. From the perspective of the Mexican state, it is essential to acknowledge the efforts and policies implemented to promote the rights and well being of indigenous communities. So, the San Andres Accords, signed in 1996, mark a significant milestone in our journey towards indigenous empowerment. They underscore the importance of basic respect for the diversity of indigenous populations, preservation of natural resources, and enhance participation in decision making processes. Key discussions include the recognition of indigenous languages, cultures, and traditions, as well as the autonomy of indigenous communities in shaping their own development plans and participating in state affairs. Furthermore, the Mexican government have allocated resources towards infrastructure development, healthcare services, and education in indigenous communities. These investments aim to address systematic challenges and create pathways for sustainable development. For example, in 2022, the budget for well-being programs for indigenous communities increased by 67%. In 2019, the CDHDF Human Rights Commission of Mexico City recognizes the fundamental role of indigenous languages as vital components of justice, education, and cultural preservation. Collaboration with civil society organizations and indigenous leaders remains integral to their approach. Initiatives like the National Indigenous Congresses serve as platforms for dialogue and cooperation, fostering a renewed relationship between the state and indigenous communities. Moving forward, the Mexican state must redouble their efforts to tackle persistent inequalities faced by marginalized ethnic communities, and this include implementing targeted economic development programs, prioritizing infrastructure investment, enhancing educational opportunities, and ensuring equitable access to healthcare services, and facilitating the job training and employment, strengthening political and social participation, and promoting tolerance and combating discrimination. By embracing these actions, they reaffirm their commitment to building a more inclusive and equitable society for all.
So I'm going to be representing the other international actors, the United States and Canada, and NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement. So basically, the idea behind NAFTA was to open up trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And they wanted to do this in order, the idea was to lower prices, to get cheaper goods for the United States. And in Mexico, you saw a shift from like rural agriculture to a more industrialized approach to their economy. And I think the position of the United States and Canada was they wanted to, one, have cheaper goods for at cheaper prices in both the United States and Canada for consumers, and companies wanted a cheaper labor force. And Mexico viewed it as an opportunity for job creation. And unfortunately, the reality of this was much more complicated. And NAFTA, the effects of NAFTA has been relatively controversial. But I think a better agreement would be something that has more labor regulations and can be more favorable to indigenous and more vulnerable communities, because I feel like often international trade comes at the expense of more lower income and vulnerable communities. So I think it would be both in the interest of Mexico, the United States, and Canada to facilitate more better labor practices.
Hi, I'm Diego, and I'm gonna talk about the indigenous actor in this conflict, which is the Zapatist Uprising Group, or EZLN. So, in 1994, the Zapatist Uprising in Chiapas stemmed from historical marginalization and NAFTA's impact on indigenous people's lives. Chiapas is a rich and powerful state in resources, but still marginalized. And it's so 70% of its indigenous population suffer from malnutrition and poverty and lack of education. The Zapatist movement demanded land, work, and basic rights for the indigenous people in all Mexico. So after taking armed conflict to Mexican government, they stopped fire, they ceased fire in order to achieve an understanding between both governments, leading to the San Andres Peace Accords that aim for indigenous self-determination, contrasting with the government's pro-NAFTA stance. After a long time of deliberation, fights between both armies, and final resolution, the government aimed to suppress the EZLN to reassure foreign investors. Eventually, in 2001, Mexico recognized indigenous autonomy within an unfettered nation. This conflict led to the creation of the National Commission for Development of Indigenous Towns, striving for indigenous rights and cultural preservation that remains still today. This has led Chiapas to stop being so marginalized as it was from the last century, even though still it's one of the most marginalized states in Mexico. It gets now the self-determination that they were asking for by the ideology that Emiliano Zapata left with the phrase, "The lands are from the ones who work them," and so they now have the right, and it's recognized by the Mexican government to have self-determination, to achieve their own governments, their own laws within the within the Mexican Constitution, and being respected all their customs, traditions, and the way they see things due to their beliefs and ways of living. And still today, the Zapatist movement has their own page from internet, and they still are fighting for equality between indigenous people and non-indigenous people.